Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to a notification from the government. The message is simple. You have 25 days to hand over your life savings. If you refuse, you will be fined the modern equivalent of $200,000 and thrown in federal prison for 10 years. It sounds like a dystopian nightmare, something that happens in a collapsing dictatorship or a communist regime. But this didn't happen in North Korea, and it didn't happen in the Soviet Union. It happened right here, in the land of the free. On April 5th, 1933, the President of the United States committed the greatest wealth heist in history. He didn't use a mask. He didn't use a gun. He used a pen. With one signature, Executive Order 6102 turned innocent savers into criminals overnight. Your property was no longer yours. The gold in your safe? Illegal. The coins in your pocket? Contraband. And the most terrifying part wasn't the theft itself. It was that millions of Americans volunteered to be robbed. They lined up at the banks, handed over their wealth, and thanked the government for taking it. How did he get away with it? Why did the public accept it? And what happened to the people who said no? This is the untold story of the day America confiscated its own money and the chaos that followed.
The bleeding patient.
To understand why a government would turn on its own people, we have to understand the desperation of 1933. This wasn't just a recession, it was an apocalypse. We've all seen the black and white photos of bread lines, but the numbers tell a darker story. By the winter of 1933, the American economy had effectively stopped. Unemployment wasn't just high, in some cities it was 80%. In Toledo, Ohio, 4 out of 5 men had no work. There was no welfare. There was no unemployment insurance. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And the banks were burning. In the 3 years leading up to 1933, over 5,000 banks had collapsed. These weren't orderly shutdowns. One day the bank was open, the next day the doors were padlocked, and your life savings were gone forever. This created a psychology of terror. The American people realized that paper money in a bank account was just a promise. And the promise was being broken every day. So they stopped trusting paper. They wanted the only thing that was real. They wanted gold. Under the law at the time, this was their right. The US dollar was on the gold standard. You could walk into any Federal Reserve Bank with a $20 bill and demand a $20 gold coin made of 90% pure gold. And that is exactly what people did. It was a run on the nation. Lines stretched for blocks. People slept on the sidewalks outside banks, waiting for them to open, desperate to trade their paper for metal before the bank ran out. They took the gold home and hid it. They buried it in jars in the backyard. They hid it under floorboards. Wealthy families chartered boats to ship their gold to London or Switzerland. To the average citizen, this was survival. But to the government, it was a disaster. The Federal Reserve was legally required to hold 40 cents of gold for every dollar it printed. As the gold left the vaults and went under mattresses, the government's gold supply shrank. And because the gold supply shrank, they were forced by law to shrink the supply of paper money too. It was a trap of their own making. The government needed to print money to fight the Depression, but the people were hiding the gold that backed the money. The economy was choking to death, and the government felt they had no choice but to break the lock.
The bank holiday.
Franklin D. Roosevelt took office on Saturday, March 4th, 1933. The country was in ruins. The banking system had collapsed so completely that on his inauguration day, you couldn't cash a check in Washington, D.C. FDR didn't wait. He didn't ask Congress for permission. He didn't hold a debate. At 1 a.m. on Monday, March 6th, just 36 hours after becoming president, he declared war on the economy. He issued a proclamation using a forgotten law from World War I called the Trading with the Enemy Act. But the enemy wasn't Germany. The enemy was the American saver. He ordered a national bank holiday. Every bank in the United States was ordered to close. Imagine the chaos. On Monday morning, millions of Americans went to work, to the grocery store, to the gas station, and found that their money was frozen. Checks were worthless. Credit didn't exist. Cash was scarce. For 1 week, America ran on IOUs. In Salt Lake City, the Chamber of Commerce issued wooden coins to keep trade moving. In other towns, people bartered eggs for gasoline. It was a total freeze of the financial system. FDR's goal was to stop the bleeding. He had to stop people from withdrawing gold. He kept the banks closed until Congress could pass the Emergency Banking Act. The bill was rushed through the House of Representatives in 38 minutes. Most congressmen hadn't even read it. They held up a folded newspaper and shouted, "Vote." When the banks finally reopened on March 13th, the trap was set. The new law gave the Secretary of the Treasury the power to require all citizens to surrender their gold. The legal framework for the heist was now in place.
The order and the propaganda.
On April 5, 1933, the hammer dropped. Executive Order 6102. The order was blunt. It demanded that all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates be delivered to the Federal Reserve by May 1st. That gave the American people less than 1 month to surrender their wealth. But FDR knew he couldn't send the police to every single house in America. There were millions of homes. It was physically impossible to search them all. He needed the people to comply voluntarily. So he launched a psychological war. The weapon wasn't force, it was shame. The government and the media began a coordinated campaign to rebrand saving as hoarding. Newspapers ran cartoons showing gold hoarders as greedy villains starving the economy. The message was clear. The depression isn't the government's fault. It's your neighbor's fault because he is hiding gold. FDR went on the radio for his famous fireside chats. His voice was calm, fatherly, and reassuring. He told the American people that the gold was needed in the vaults to back the currency and create jobs. He framed the surrender of gold as a supreme act of patriotism. If you gave up your gold, you were a hero helping to rebuild America. If you kept it, you were a traitor. And then came the threat. The executive order stated that anyone caught holding gold after the deadline would face a $10,000 fine, a fortune in those days, and up to 10 years in prison. The combination of patriotism and terror worked.
The surrender.
In the weeks following the order, a strange scene played out across America. Lines formed at Federal Reserve banks. But these weren't runs on the bank. They were runs to the bank. People arrived carrying heavy satchels, old leather bags, and wooden boxes. They handed over gold coins that had been in their families since the Civil War. They handed over their wedding gifts. They handed over their insurance against disaster. In exchange, the tellers handed them paper Federal Reserve notes. The rate was fixed, $20.67 per ounce. Journalists at the time described the scene. One reporter in New York watched as an old woman handed over a small jar of gold coins. She was crying. She told the teller it was all she had to leave to her grandchildren. The teller counted it, handed her a stack of paper bills, and threw the coins into a canvas sack on the floor. By the deadline of May 1st, the government had collected millions of ounces of gold. The vaults were filling up. The hoarders had been broken. But not everyone complied.
The resistance.
For every person who lined up at the bank, there was another who looked at the order and said no. This is the part of history that often gets ignored. We think of 1933 as a time of total compliance, but there was a massive silent resistance. Many Americans simply kept their gold, didn't take it to the bank, they buried it deeper. They figured that the government couldn't search every backyard in Kansas. They took a calculated risk. I will wait them out. Others were more aggressive. There was a surge in financial tourism. Wealthy Americans took sudden vacations to Canada, Mexico, or Europe. Their luggage was suspiciously heavy on the way out and much lighter on the way back. Swiss banks saw a massive inflow of American deposits. The wealthy moved their assets out of FDR's reach, leaving the middle class, who couldn't afford to travel, to bear the brunt of the confiscation. And then there were those who fought back legally. The most famous case was that of Frederick Barber Campbell. Campbell wasn't a radical. He was a Manhattan lawyer, but he was a man who believed in the Constitution. He had deposited 27 bars of gold, over 11,000 ounces, at Chase National Bank. That gold was worth over $200,000 at the time. When the confiscation order came down, Chase Bank attempted to seize its gold to send it to the Fed. Campbell marched into the bank and demanded his property. When they refused, he sued. His argument was dangerous to the government. He cited the Fifth Amendment. nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Campbell argued that paying him in paper dollars, which were rapidly losing value due to inflation, was not just compensation. He argued that the president did not have the authority to seize private property by executive decree. The government was terrified of Campbell. If he won in the Supreme Court, the entire house of cards would fall. Every ounce of gold would have to be returned. The printing presses would stop. So the government stopped playing nice. A federal grand jury indicted Campbell. They turned a civil property dispute into a criminal case. They threatened to throw him in prison just for trying to protect his own savings. It was a show of force. It sent a chilling message to every other lawyer and wealthy citizen in America. If you challenge us, we will destroy you. Ultimately, the government avoided a Supreme Court ruling on the constitutionality of the theft. They dropped the criminal charges against Campbell, but they kept his gold. They denied him the victory in court to protect the system. Campbell remained a free man, but he died knowing that in America, property rights existed only until the government decided they didn't.
The Great Swindle.
By January 1934, the resistance had been crushed. The gold was in government hands. The public held paper. And that is when FDR pulled the rug out from under everyone. It is the most cynical moment in American economic history. For months, the government had insisted that gold was worth $20.67 an ounce. That is what they paid the grandmothers, the farmers, and the workers who turned in their coins. But on January 31st, 1934, once the government controlled the supply, FDR issued a new proclamation. He declared that gold was now worth $35 an ounce. Do the math. The government forced you to sell at $20, then they repriced their own inventory to $35. Instantly, the U.S. Treasury booked a profit of $2.8 billion. That's about $65 billion in today's money. It was pure profit created by the stroke of a pen transferred directly from the pockets of the people to the coffers of the state. But the profit wasn't the only goal. This was a devaluation. By raising the price of gold, FDR effectively admitted that the paper dollar was now worth 40% less. The people who had obeyed the law, the people who had been patriotic, were the ones who paid the price. They were left holding paper money that bought less food, less clothing, and less land. The hoarders, the ones who hid their gold, the ones who broke the law, were the ones who preserved their wealth. It was a brutal lesson in moral hazard. The government punished the obedient and rewarded the rebellious.
The aftermath and the future.
For the next 40 years, owning monetary gold remained illegal for American citizens. The stolen gold was melted down into bars and moved to a new, impregnable fortress built specifically for this hoard, the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox. Fort Knox became a symbol of American strength, but in reality, it was a monument to confiscation. The gold inside didn't belong to the government by right, it belonged to them by force. During this period, the FBI actually investigated citizens suspected of hoarding gold. Safe deposit boxes were monitored. The taboo against owning gold became so strong that an entire generation of Americans forgot that money was ever anything other than paper. But while Americans were banned from owning gold, the U.S. government was using that stolen wealth to build an empire.
The empire of debt.
Fast forward to 1944. World War II was nearing its end. The great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, were physically and financially destroyed. Their vaults were empty, their industries were bombed out. The U.S. stood alone. It had the factories, it had the nukes, and thanks to Executive Order 6102, it had the gold. The U.S. held nearly 70% of the world's official gold reserves. So, when world leaders gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war economy, the United States dictated the terms. The deal was simple but revolutionary. Every country would peg their currency to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, the exact price FDR set after the theft. It was a brilliant trap. The U.S. told the world, trust our dollar. It's as good as gold. The world agreed. The dollar became the world reserve currency.
This gave America an exorbitant privilege. The US could print paper dollars for free and use them to buy real cars from Germany, real wine from France, and real oil from the Middle East. For 20 years, the system worked. America boomed. It seemed like the heist of 1933 had paid off. But Ponzi schemes always have an expiration date.
The second betrayal.
The problem with the Bretton Woods system was greed. In the 1960s, the US government wanted to have its cake and eat it too. They wanted to fight a massive war in Vietnam. They wanted to build a massive welfare state at home, and they wanted to send men to the moon. These things cost billions, but the government didn't want to raise taxes. So they did what they always do. They turned on the printing press. They printed billions of new dollars. But remember the rule. The dollar was promised to be redeemable for gold. As the pile of paper dollars grew taller, the pile of gold in Fort Knox stayed the same size. The math didn't work. Smart foreign leaders began to notice. In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle looked at the numbers and called America's bluff. He ordered the French Navy to load millions of paper US dollars onto ships, sail them across the Atlantic, and demand the gold that was promised. Other nations followed. The run on the bank was happening again, but this time it was foreign governments. The gold began to flow out of Fort Knox at a terrifying speed. In the late 1950s, the U.S. held over 20,000 tons of gold. By 1971, it had dropped to 8,000 tons. The nation was being drained. President Richard Nixon was now in the Oval Office, and he faced the exact same dilemma FDR faced in 1933. Option A, stop printing money and honor the promise. Option B, break the promise and keep the gold. On Sunday, August 15, 1971, Nixon interrupted the popular TV show Bonanza. He looked into the camera and delivered the sequel to Executive Order 6102. He announced that he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That was over 50 years ago. The window never reopened. In 1933, the government stole the gold from the people. In 1971, they stole the value from the dollar itself.
The silent robbery.
From that moment, the US dollar became a fiat currency. Fiat is Latin for let it be done. It is money because the government says it is money. It is backed by nothing. This removed the last restraint. They could print as much as they wanted. And they did. The graph of the US money supply looks like a hockey stick. It goes straight up. We call this inflation, but inflation is just a polite word for theft. Since 1913, the dollar has lost over 96% of its value. Most of that drop happened after 1971. When the government prints $1 trillion, they siphoned off your purchasing power to pay their debts. FDR stole it physically. The modern government steals it digitally. Just look at gold. It went from $35 to $2,000. That isn't gold getting stronger. That is the dollar dying.
The future threat.
So we return to the question, could it happen again? Today, the government is $34 trillion in debt. Interest payments are exploding. The system is insolvent. They are trapped. They must print money to survive. But if they print money, people will flee the dollar. So logic dictates that the government must eventually close the exits again. But this time, they won't need a physical dragnet. They are building central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. A CBDC is a digital dollar that lives on the Federal Reserve's database. It is programmable money. With the CBDC, Executive Order 6102 doesn't require a police officer. It requires a line of code. They can put an expiration date on your money. They can freeze the accounts of hoarders or political dissidents instantly. The infrastructure for confiscation is already built.
The lesson. The story of 1933 is a warning. The people who lost everything were the ones who believed the rules were permanent. The people who survived were the ones who understood counterparty risk. If your wealth depends on someone else's permission, you don't really own it. So, what is the retro wealth lesson? Diversify your sovereignty. Don't keep 100% of your life's work inside the system. Own physical assets that have no counterparty. own digital bearer assets that you control with your own keys. Understand that laws are only paper, and in a crisis, paper burns. FDR took the gold, but he left us a warning. Governments will always protect themselves at the expense of the saver. The promise will be broken. The rules will change. The only person coming to save you is you. This is Retro Wealth. Make sure you are subscribed because in our next documentary, we are going to expose the secret deal that replaced gold with oil, the hidden history of the petrodollar. You won't want to miss it.